HRC. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We have a very exciting panel for everybody. So first, we're going to hear from HRC President Kelly Robinson. Then we will hear from our Senior Director of Legal and Policy, Kate Oakley. And then we will hear about how we can actually take action in this moment from our Director of Regional and Local Campaigns, Reg Calcagno. So before we get started, I wanted to just make sure folks know how everything is going to work. So we know that you probably have a lot of questions. And so what we're going to do is we are going to not screen them, but we will make sure that you're able to get them answered by, you can either like put them in the chat, we'll try to answer them in writing, or what we will do is we will actually answer them on the actual Zoom. All right, so without further ado, um, our next person up is HRC President Kelly Robinson. Okay, give us one more minute. We're getting Kelly up. But while we wait, if you have any questions about anything around Skrmetti, you can definitely start putting that in the Q&A area, and we will start answering questions in writing, or we will be able to answer them at the end. We hope all of you are hanging in there. Hi, Kelly.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me tonight. I'm making a little cameo from my parental leave because this moment is critical and it's important and it's also chaotic. And I'm really grateful to all of you who have joined us here tonight. And I'm truly grateful for the full team at the Human Rights Campaign and all of our volunteers and activists across the country that even in the darkest of times continue to be a light for our people. So, as you know, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in the case of the United States versus Skrmetti. It was nowhere near the decision that we wanted or needed for the safety of our kids and our families. But considering this court, a court handpicked by Donald Trump, it also was not entirely unexpected. So tonight, as John said, we're going to talk about a couple things. One, what this decision means for us and for our children. We're going to talk about what the legal and political landscape looks like now. And we're going to round out by talking about the most important thing, and that is what we can do, what we need to do to fight back. First, let's talk about what this decision means for our children. Look, 8 weeks ago, my wife and I welcomed our second child into the world. You know, when I look at her and I look at her big brother, I am clear-eyed about our role as parents. Not to just to accept them for who they are, but to give them the love, the support, the care that they need to grow into who they will be, who they can become. This decision makes all of that work harder. It makes it harder for parents to get their children's basic needs met. It makes it harder for providers to treat their patients. It makes kids feel unsafe in their communities and uncared for by our country. There are few who feel more uncertain about their future than trans kids in America today. Our Chief of Staff, Jay Brown, made this point at the rally that we helped organize after the decision was handed down, but it bears repeating tonight. We can never lose sight of the fact that this is about kids. Kids with scraped knees and straight A's, kids who love to swim and hate sunscreen, kids who make us laugh, big belly laughs, kids who make us cry tears of joy, kids who are shy yet confident, sometimes scared but always defiant. These children are our responsibility. They are all of our responsibility. When my baby girl asked me in 10 and 20 years from now what I was doing in this moment, I will be proud to say, in the words of my dear friend and mentor, Cecile Richards, that our moment gave everything that we could. I will be proud to say that I was arm in arm with the 3.6 million members of the Human Rights Campaign who knew then, as we know now, that LGBTQ plus rights are basic human rights, period. All of this leads me to my second point, what the legal and political landscape looks like now. And on this point, we've got to be very clear. Right now, there are 6 judges sitting on the United States Supreme Court who do not believe that our children are our future. and that freedom is our right. These judges are doing the bidding of a feckless president who has abandoned his duty, corrupted our courts, and weaponized the very institutions that are meant to protect us. But even when they were trying their best to do their worst, we must be clear where this decision starts and where it ends. What this ruling did was uphold the ban on gender affirming care in Tennessee, making it more difficult to overturn similar bans in other states. What this ruling does not do is it does not ban gender affirming care nationwide. I have to say that one more time. This ruling does not do is that it does not ban gender affirming care nationwide. Remember Timothy Snyder's first lesson for fighting tyranny. We cannot obey in advance. There are 24 states where our children can get the care that they need. And the other 27, well, that's where we've got to do work to build more power. We've got to do work to continue to fight back. This is urgent, y'all. There are other cases working their way through the courts meant to destroy our community piece by piece. These cases will determine whether parents can opt out their children from hearing LGBTQ plus stories in our schools. These cases will decide if employers can stop covering life-saving preventative care like HIV prevention and cancer screenings at no cost. Cases like these will decide if states can people on Medicaid from getting care at Planned Parenthood health centers. We are only months into this administration and we have years to go. We have got to keep fighting back. In times like these, hopelessness can feel so real. But we've got to be very clear. We are not without hope, and we are certainly not without power. The Human Rights Campaign is the largest LGBTQ plus civil rights organization in the nation, and we are growing by the second. Today, we have clear eyes, full hearts, and strategy in place to shift our momentum and unite our movement. In the wake of the Skrmetti decision, we are leveraging our partnerships to ensure our kids are safe. That means getting accurate information out through our community partners. That means getting worker benefits straightened through our corporate partners. That means ensuring trans students are welcomed at the schools we work with. We are mobilizing our members at the state level. We are making sure to do the work to help us to overturn these hate-filled bans and defend laws that support gender-affirming care. We're going to need some of you to testify before lawmakers. We're going to need all of you to talk to your neighbors to win this fight, to push through this critical moment. It will take all of us. Now, you're going to get more information about how to take action in a minute, but here's the bottom line. One, we've got to keep building our people power. Two, we got to keep changing the way that people think, sharing our stories, meeting people at their heart center. And three, we have to keep disrupting political and social systems that are not serving us, to end hate, to advance freedom, and to protect our very democracy. Because HRC, that's the only way to ensure that my kids, that your kids, that all of our kids will be free to be exactly who they are. So thank you, because you don't just show up when times are good. You show up in the darkest of times to get our community closer to free. And this is one of those moments. Thank you for being in the fight. Thank you for being in the movement. I'm going to hand the mic back to John because there's more work for us to do.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And as Kelly said, we're going to hear a little bit tonight from a panel of folks, including Kate Oakley, who is our director of state and our director of legal policy, or senior director of legal policy here at HRC. Kate.
Okay, friends, thanks for bearing with me while I dealt with the tech. So here we go. My name is Catherine Kate Oakley. I am the Senior Director for Legal Policy here at the Human Rights Campaign. And I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk through what the decision was and where we go from here. I will not be giving a full-on con law lecture, but I will give you a little tiny bit of a peek in so that you can understand what the conversation was that was happening before the United States Supreme Court, and the decision that was made. So this case was originally filed by the ACLU, Lambda, and a private firm against the state of Tennessee. Tennessee had passed a bill that is called SB1, which banned gender-affirming care, including puberty blockers and hormones, for transgender youth. This was signed into law in March 2023, and a suit was filed shortly thereafter. The lawsuit was joined by the United States. This was a huge deal. The Department of Justice under the Biden administration joined this case as a party because they agreed that SB1 and its ban was unconstitutional. That means that at oral arguments, the then Solicitor General of the United States and Chase Strangio of the ACLU gave the oral argument before the court. Unfortunately, after the election, as you might imagine, the United States and the Department of Justice under the Trump administration withdrew their support for the plaintiffs who were challenging the constitutionality of SB1. But they did support the case moving forward. There is a 15-year-old girl who is at the center of this case as the plaintiff. Her parents are among the plaintiffs who brought this case forward. And obviously, that takes a lot of bravery from them and also their daughter. So, what was the question that was in front of the Supreme Court for deciding? Well, the question was, does SB1, this Tennessee law, discriminate against transgender people on the basis of sex, therefore triggering intermediate scrutiny as the appropriate level of constitutional review? Now, if I've lost you, let me just catch you up on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and why this is even a question to be asked. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment says that no state, so this is talking about the government and the state, for in this case Tennessee, shall make or enforce any law which shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. What that means is this was one of our amendments that were passed at the end of the Civil War. And this the Civil War was a great illustration of how states are not always protecting the civil rights of the people who live inside that state. And so the 14th Amendment was passed along with the other civil rights amendments in order to ensure that folks who live in a state are not discriminated against by the state. Now, in general, when legislatures pass laws, courts assume they're constitutional because that's what the legislature is there for, is to pass laws. But when the law is talking about people and say making some people better off and some people worse off because of characteristics that those people have, the court is going to be more skeptical of the legislature's motivations, and they're going to look at the law more closely. So the con law jargon here is with scrutiny. So going back to the question that you see in the yellow box, does Tennessee's ban on transgender youth being able to access gender affirming care discriminate against transgender people on the basis of sex? On the basis of sex is important for reasons I'll talk about in just a second, but sex is looked at under intermediate scrutiny. That's the way that the court examines what is suspected to be discrimination on the basis of sex, is with intermediate scrutiny. So they're looking more closely than they would for a regular law. And is that the appropriate level of constitutional review? That was a question that was before the court. I am not going to go into this entire chart. You know, if you're into con law, there's so much to be said here. But you can see that I circled sex up here at the top because when we're looking at the scrutiny test, so this is how closely the government or the courts are going to look at a law that has been passed, this is how they'll know how closely they need to look. If that law is discriminating on the basis of race, for example, they're going to apply something that's called strict scrutiny. Laws almost always fail this test because there aren't constitutional ways to discriminate on the basis of race. So the question that the court asks is the law necessary to the achievement of a compelling government interest? If the law isn't necessary, if the government interest isn't compelling, then the law is going to fail to pass this test. That almost always happens. What the hope was for the Skrmetti case was to show that SB1 was not substantially related to an important government interest. So that government interest in preventing trans youth from being able to access gender affirming care was not important, or that this law or policy was not related to that. And if the answer to the question was yes, that SB1 discriminated on the basis of sex, then you would get this intermediate scrutiny, which is a closer look by the court at the law, as opposed to rational basis, which is this third bucket, which is how most laws are considered. Is the law or policy rationally related to a legitimate government interest? Laws almost always pass that test. So going back to the question before SCOTUS, does SB1 discriminate against trans people on the basis of sex, triggering intermediate scrutiny? The lawyers made two legal arguments that SB1 discriminates on the basis of sex. And they're both below. I'm not going to go into these in depth, but essentially what you need to know is if trans folks are being treated differently than cisgender folks, it is very difficult to argue that that doesn't at some level have to do with the transgender person's sex. Is it because the young person is behaving in a way that's inconsistent with their sex at birth? Is it because the trans person's existence and need for medical care is inconsistent with Tennessee's expectations about what's acceptable for folks who have this assigned sex at birth? Different ways to look at the question and frame it up. But ultimately, discrimination against someone because they're transgender really often is correlated with discrimination on the basis of sex. In fact, I would argue that it's always correlated with discrimination on the basis of sex. And that's something that we have seen in case law, constitutional case law, statutory case law, all over the place. So this is not something that was invented out of whole cloth by these attorneys or, of course, by the Solicitor General of the United States. These were very well supported legal arguments that were made here in this case, and ultimately continued to be made on the way up to the United States Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court decided that SB1 does not discriminate on the basis of sex. They looked at the parts of the record that they were able to see. So they looked at as many of the facts as came in front of them. And they said, this isn't about discrimination. This is about a rational regulation of medical practice. Now, those of us who are deeply embedded in LGBTQ work and who care very deeply about trans youth being able to have access to the best practice, medically necessary care that they deserve, we know that this is discrimination. And I will tell you that part of my role is to fight back against bad bills that are introduced and to try to stop them from becoming law. And I can tell you that the amount of discrimination that is expressed by these lawmakers prior even to the bill being passed, there's no question that what's happening here is discrimination. And as I said, I feel strongly it is discrimination on the basis of sex. But the Supreme Court said that the regulation of medical practice is a government interest, that SB1 is a rational attempt to try to regulate medicine to make sure that medicine is being practiced appropriately. And as a result, they upheld SB1 and they blocked the pathway to challenging other trans healthcare bans. They blocked this pathway. And to be clear, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, there are other ways that these bans can be challenged, but it is going to be significantly harder to do that now after Skrmetti. Okay, what does this mean for other anti-transgender laws? This is one of the big questions that the lawyers like me were looking at with this decision, because what matters here is, of course, what's happening in Tennessee, but also legally speaking, what matters here is how we're going to be able to proceed in challenging other anti-transgender laws after the Skrmetti decision. So, SB1 has now officially survived this Equal Protection Clause challenge. That's what the Supreme Court said. SB1 in Tennessee is not a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. There are, as Kelly mentioned, a lot of other states, almost half the country, who have passed these bans on transgender young folks being able to access medically necessary best practice care. Those challenges, if they are going to move forward and be successful, are going to have to move forward on claims other than Equal Protection Clause and specifically sex-based discrimination. Many, I would say almost all of the cases so far have incorporated some of this same thinking that was in the Skrmetti case. And so they may need to be amended, they may need to be revisited. But I also want us to say that Skrmetti is limited to trans health care. And the reason that it's limited to trans health care is because the court had an opportunity to say, if you remember my chart from a few slides ago, court had the opportunity to say that anti-transgender discrimination is always going to be judged on the basis of which level of scrutiny. And they declined to answer that question. They really sidestepped the equal protection question. And instead, they said, well, this is rational. This is a reasonable way to get at this legitimate government interest. And they didn't answer the question of what level of scrutiny should be applied to anti-trans legislation in the future. So this is limited to healthcare. So that means we don't really know what is going to happen with other anti-trans laws and policies, and how the Skrmetti decision is going to be imported into those cases or not. There are other constitutional bases upon which we can make claims. I know the Obergefell decision turns 10 this year, and to remind folks that the Obergefell decision, which was the marriage equality decision, that was an equal protection decision. It was also a due process decision. So there are multiple different attacks that we can make on discriminatory legislation, and this is not the end of the road. But this is a really, really scary time for a lot of folks, because everything that I just said about the legal path forward is really important to the lawyers, but I suspect is pretty cold comfort to folks who are finding that they are not going to be able to access medical care. This is a Supreme Court decision that is going to change the lives of so many thousands of young people across this country and their families who have been fighting to make sure that they get the care that their pediatricians, their endocrinologists, their entire support systems have made clear is what is in their best interest. As a parent myself, I am just appalled by the idea that legislators could disregard the science, disregard the experts, and pass a ban that would prevent me from getting my child any kind of medically necessary best practice care that my pediatrician recommended. And my heart goes out to all of the people who have been so deeply impacted by this, because I know it is incredibly hard. I also want to say the challenge is not over. The legal challenges are not over. The fight is not over. This work is grueling. It involves creativity, resilience, persistence, and a lot of time to change. And what's so hard in this particular context is that these young folks don't have time for us to fix the system. And in the meantime, they are being treated just absolutely abominably by our country. And it is really hard to watch. And I also really want to make it clear that we are fighting and we're going to keep fighting. Um, I am about to pass this over to my colleague, Reg, who is going to talk to you more about that fighting. Please continue to put questions in the Q&A. I haven't been able to answer them as I've been speaking, but I will do my best. And we will also take questions at the end. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to my friend, my colleague, my co-conspirator, the fabulous, wonderful Reg Calcagno, who is the Director of Regional and State Campaigns and also one of the best advocates that I know. So I'm going to toss you over to Reg so that he can talk to you about what is coming next.
Thank you so much, Kate, and we will see you shortly for questions, I believe.
I'm
So,
going to stop sharing my screen. Okay.
I think you're good.
I did it. Okay, great. Go for it.
In bit. So thank you so much, Kate, for giving us that breakdown. And as Kate said, the fight is not over. This ruling was pretty devastating. As has been said, the court failed to uphold the dignity, autonomy, and healthcare rights of young transgender folks across the country. And we also know that this is not new. States like Tennessee are dealing with this ban. Other states have been dealing with this ban long before the case went to the Supreme Court. This decision felt like a serious blow on Wednesday. I remember like reading it and seeing it come in and feeling it just sort of hit me. And the commentary after the fact as a trans person also feels a little bit like an exercise in troll dodging. And it's hard not to feel discouraged. And for trans folks, we understand all too well how hard it can be to hear strangers telling us how to live our lives, how we should go about fighting for our rights, how we should go about winning dignity that shouldn't need to be fought for. But again, this decision was not the final word. Our community has faced setbacks before, and the fact remains that the freedom to be ourselves is a freedom that is worth fighting for, and it is a freedom that we are going to continue to fight for. Thank you for showing up tonight. I'm a firm believer community is rocked by something like this, that we do better when we're together, when we know we're not alone. And beyond the laws and facts of every case, there's the other stories, there's the subplots, right? So in Skrmetti, the subplot here was community and possibility. This was a case where our community showed up before, during, and after to reaffirm our commitment to protecting one another. Outside of the outcome here, we saw a number of possibility models showcased. This is the first case. I know Kate mentioned briefly that Chase Strangio from the ACLU argued this case. It was the first case before the court that an openly transgender person was the person who was putting forth the arguments, was the person who was dealing with the justices. The night before the arguments, there was a cohort of transgender attorneys who were sworn in to practice before the Supreme Court. These are all possibility models that weren't around before. These are all people who represent some of our best and brightest. The day of the arguments, there was a huge crowd gathered with signs that read "Trans stories are everyone's stories." And during that rally, we heard from advocates, we heard from doctors, we heard from parents, we heard from kids who have received that life-saving care. Kids who have been able to, just be kids, focus on that, focus on everything else that they have to deal with. And even in the wake of the decision last Wednesday and this weekend and next weekend, we saw crowds gathered to rally to protect trans youth, to show up and say, we're still here and we're still fighting. This case didn't have the outcome, the legal outcome that we wanted. But this case wasn't just about all of the facts. It was also about community. and possibility. And we are a community that is built for this moment. At the top of the call, Kelly talked about building people power, talked about the importance of changing narratives. You just heard Kate talk about how, there are many legal pathways forward, and there are a lot of other pathways forward. It is now that we need to, go beyond the court. And I assure you that there are enough of us to keep this movement going for as long as it takes to achieve justice. In the meantime, however, there are 3 ways that you can take action tonight. First, speak up. While the court rules on laws, they are not responsible for passing national legislation. That can only be done by Congress, and we are working with pro-equality champions in Congress to pass Becca Balance Transgender Healthcare Access Act. Now, this act would train more providers in gender-affirming care. It would improve medical education, would expand capacity of community health centers, and expand access in rural communities. While it won't overturn bans, it'll help protect the funding in the care in states where care is still needed. You can tell your elected officials to co-sponsor and support this bill at hrc.im/transhealth, and we'll make sure to drop that in the chat. And then second, speak out. We know that when we tell our stories, when we introduce ourselves, we get a little bit more nuance. A lot of the stories that have come out of the, during and post Skrmetti ruling really talk about the trans community in black and white terms. They really talk about our community in a way that loses the joy, that loses the nuance, that loses all of the details that we know are present. Those details can only be really fully communicated when we're talking with one another, when we're sharing our stories. And to that end, I invite you to join our 1 Million Voices for Equality campaign, where we're asking people to share their stories. When you share your story, you help us share the stories of the LGBTQ+ community, humanizes us. It helps us create that narrative of change that Kelly talked about earlier, and helps us show the world how these laws are affecting real Americans across the country. We'll drop the link in the chat. That'll be hrc.im/1, the number 1 million. And then third, you can tell your story, you can call your rep, but we know that one voice alone can't do it. So we invite you to strengthen your voice. If the Supreme Court won't defend our rights, then we'll build the power that it takes to do it ourselves. We'll go state by state and law by law and conversation by conversation. And those conversations start with phone banks. Now, as an organizer, I'm not going to pass up the chance to invite you all to take action and join us at a phone bank this Wednesday, this very Wednesday. So June 20th, June 25th, we will have 2 options for training. You can join us in phone banking and calling our members of Congress, urging their support for transgender youth. So Wednesday, June 25th at 12 p.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be holding 2 phone banks, and that is the start of our season of action, and we'll continue holding phone banks really pretty much every week. Well, for as long as I'm the director of the campaigns. So we'll see what happens there. And the URL is https tinyurl HRC/Skrmetti phone bank. And I believe Jen is going to drop that in the chat as well. So again, 3 actions: speak up, call your congressional representative, speak out, share your story. And finally, strengthen your voice. Join us for a phone bank. Invite others to take action. And with that, I'm going to invite my colleagues back so that we can take some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Reg and Kate. We definitely have a lot of questions in the chat that folks have been putting in. If folks want to continue to put in questions in the chat, we will answer as many as possible. So our first question is, what can HRC do to ensure that gender affirming care remains available in the politically blue states that weren't directly affected by the decision? And what about hospitals in those states that are caving to right-wing pressure to stop offering care? I will also say that there are some other hospitals that are called out by name. We're not going to do that right here, but thinking about larger hospitals that were providing that care.
Yeah, and look, I mean, this is it's awful, right? Like this is awful. And I also think it's important to mention that there are other threats to trans healthcare that are in the works. And I think that what we're seeing with some of the blue states medical providers is that there are additional concerns beyond just the Skrmetti decision that are making people very nervous. One of those, and somebody else mentioned this in the Q&A, is that the president issued an executive order. He issued several problematic executive orders, but one of them was to try to really get rid of, to the extent that the executive branch has the power to do some of this, and perhaps in his view of what they have power to do is different from mine. Uh, but to try to prevent any sort of federally regulated healthcare provider, healthcare insurance provider, from covering transition-related care. So, for example, there was an effort to have gender-affirming care removed from TRICARE, of course, from VA benefits, and more recently, there have been some significant efforts to try to change the way the Affordable Care Act requires plans. The ACA Obamacare requires plans to cover certain types of care, and there's an effort to try to roll back gender affirming care from those requirements. And there are also the president has made it clear that it is his intention to try to withdraw federal funding, including for Medicare and Medicaid, which is accepted by virtually every medical care provider across this country, to say that those funds will not be paid to entities who are also providing gender affirming care. I suspect that it is more that type of threat that is making these hospitals change their policies. The other thing that I say, and please understand this is not me trying to excuse them, it's simply stating facts, which is that many of these hospitals have also been receiving bomb threats and other security issues that make all of their patients unsafe, and that they're responding to that. And it's devastating. And certainly some of these hospitals have been places that folks who have been living in these blue states have been able to, or I'm sorry, who've been living in these states with the bans have been able to go to these providers in blue states and have been able to continue their care there. And so having those hospital systems no longer provide that kind of care is really devastating. What can HRC do about that? Well, we have certainly been speaking to the folks who we have relationships with and trying to understand as best we can about the motivations for folks closing down, and to see if there's anything that we can do to help change the situation that they're facing. Unfortunately, I do think that some of these major federal issues are going to continue to complicate the story. Now, I also think it's very important to say, I alluded to this, but that the president believes he has a lot of powers that really go far beyond what are granted to him by the United States Constitution. And so, as we have seen in a multitude of different issue areas over the course of the last 6 months, he's going to overstep. We'll be able to challenge those things in court. We'll see how things work out. Again, I just can't emphasize enough that this is not the end of the road, that what we're at right now is a really critical juncture, and it is painful and truly scary And for right now, there are major roadblocks. I feel like I'm really going deep in this transportation analogy. There are some major roadblocks for folks who are trying to get this care, and that just can't be overstated how major those are for some folks, right? And how truly life-changing this moment is for some folks. And it is not the end of the fight to reclaim the right to be able to get best practice medical care. So this is something that we are going to continue to fight against in the courts. As I said, the president, I think, is really overstepping his power. In the first Trump administration, we were able to reverse a lot of the bad things he did because he didn't follow the rules when he did them. He didn't follow the Administrative Procedure Act. I know that the Administrative Procedure Act is maybe not the sexiest 3 words that you've heard today, but let me tell you something, you got to follow it. And if you don't, we'll see you in court. And so, there are a lot of things that we can do. Some of them will be glamorous, some of them will be deeply unglamorous, but there are a lot of things that we can do to try to change this moment and to put pressure on these hospitals to think about risk analysis in a slightly different way, because I think that's the other thing, is that there is certainly risk for them in this moment to continue providing that care. But I think there's also risk in not. And I saw that several folks in the chat were bringing up the impacts that this is going to have on young folks. And we know that this healthcare is supported by the entire mainstream American medical world. Medical, mental health. This is not a question from the people who are the experts about whether or not this care is good care. There were also a few suggestions in the chat that I want to, or in the Q&A that I want to address about the strategy, or there's nothing easier than quarterbacking from the armchair after it's all over. All of these decisions, were rational at the time they were made in terms of like what kinds of risks to take on, what kinds of risks not to take on. People made their best estimations, and a lot of things have changed since 2023 when this law passed, right? And so I'd ask people to be keeping that in mind, and also that not challenging these laws just means they stand, right? And that just means that folks in these states can't get care. And so I would also say that there is a huge obviously there is a huge amount of concern over these issues, but uh, there are some experts who have said, I think we could do gender affirming care just a little bit differently. It's not, I don't think we should do it. It's, I think that there's a way to tweak this to make this better. And that suggestion has been cherry picked and blown out of proportion to make it sound like there's something wrong with gender affirming care, that there isn't consensus that the care itself is important and wonderful and good. And so some folks were asking for resources. There was a fabulous amicus brief, which one of our questions was mentioning, that was filed in the Skrmetti case by a bunch of incredibly high profile medical and mental health organizations who laid out the science and explained why this medical care was so important. And the Supreme Court decided not to pay attention to it, which is their prerogative, unfortunately. And I will say, and this is the last thing before we go to our next question, but the district courts who have heard the many challenges to these cases have almost unanimously overturned these bans. And that's because it is the district courts that hear the evidence, right? The Supreme Court is there to answer a question of law, which is what's the appropriate level of scrutiny. The district courts are there to understand what really happened. And they're hearing from the experts on quote unquote both sides, right? Who are there to say, this is why the ban is important, this is why the ban is wrong. And the judges who have heard from the experts have almost unanimously, it was unanimously for a long time, almost unanimously come down on the side of overturning the bans, because they understand after hearing the data that there's really only one right answer here. And that the story that maybe things need to be explored further, that's what scientists do. That's what doctors do. They're always trying to deliver care better and use the science to do better. And the idea that that has been really weaponized against them in order to prevent the care from happening at all, it is completely inconsistent with the science and best practice. So with that, I'll turn it back to John. And apologies for the long answer, but there was so much good stuff in the Q&A. I wanted to make sure folks had their questions responded to.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Reg, I'm going to see if you have anything to say to that, but I also wanted to ask you a question that I think pertains to what you talked about tonight, which is there a plan for HRC to do outreach on voter registration, especially during Pride?
Yes, so this Pride, no. However, there are plans to do outreach on voter registration. We know that building political power is part of the way that we can move forward. And to that end, when we have more voters and we have more folks who are talking with us, we are more likely to get good pro-quality candidates elected. So yes, stay tuned. And if you would like to get involved in our voter registration efforts, start coming to some of our actions, and you may find yourself running a voter registration action for us. So be the change you wish to see in the world.
Great. Thanks, Reg. I think, Kate, next one's for you. What other cases is the Supreme Court planning to rule on that impact LGBTQ plus?
Yeah, it's a busy time. Well, we already had one of the decisions, in addition to Skrmetti, that we had been watching, which was the Ames decision. Some folks may have seen headlines talking about reverse discrimination case. I would recommend that people not worry too much about the Ames decision. Again, that was a very technical question of law about what kind of test needs to be applied when the courts are considering these cases. The woman who is at the center of that case hadn't even had a chance to present evidence yet. So no one found that she had experienced reverse discrimination because she was straight. It was just about whether or not the appropriate legal test had been used, and the court said no. That was a unanimous decision by the court that was written by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. So she is, as folks know, very much a liberal justice who is supportive of LGBTQ issues. It's not the alarming decision that I think some headlines made it out to be. We're also waiting to hear about the Mahmood case, which is about, comes from Montgomery County in Maryland, where some books that were including LGBTQ characters or families, or in some level talking about the issues in various age appropriate ways, were made part of the curriculum in Montgomery County, and some parents felt that they needed to be able to opt out of those lessons. One of those books, for example, is a story about a prince who it goes off to find his princess, and it turns out he falls in love with a knight at one of the other castles, and then it is the prince and the knight who fall in love and get married. It is a board book, I believe. So, it is a very chaste kind of a book. And the idea that this is something that is disturbing to folks is it is very interesting. But that case is in front of the Supreme Court, and we're expecting a decision on that likely this week. And we are also waiting for two other cases, the Braidwood case, which will, again, this is a technical in terms of its legal question. It's about whether or not this commission was correctly set up, but ultimately the decision will have major impact on whether or not preventative services like PrEP are going to be allowed to be mandated to be covered by insurance agencies. So that's another really important case. And then finally, we're also tracking very carefully the Medina case about whether or not Planned Parenthood clinics should be allowed to continue to be providing services paid for by Medicaid. And it's a very frustrating case to have poor Planned Parenthood be back in the sights yet again. But yes, those are the remaining cases that we're looking for this year.
Thank you, Kate. Reg, I believe the next question is for you, and I've combined a couple of them here. So, can you talk a little bit more about what the act in Congress that would help with gender affirming care is? What is the act called, and are there any Republican supporters in Congress? You're on mute.
You would think. The trans healthcare access. So you asked, what does the act do?
Correct.
So the Trans Healthcare Access Act, a lot of that is it really does open up access. It does not necessarily undo any bans, but what it will do is it creates more pathways for providers to become licensed in this care. It also provides a lot more resources for areas to support this care. And again, when we're talking about this type of healthcare, as Kate hinted at, it's not that it is it is not particularly special from any type of healthcare. We are not talking about doctors becoming wizards. When we're supporting healthcare institutions like this, that means more healthcare for everyone, which in this country is a necessity. So that's the first part of the question. Second, in terms of Republican co-sponsors, right now, I'm not aware of any Republican co-sponsors. However, that is part of why we have conversations with our lawmakers. It is about developing a relationship. It is about working on them. It is about, like, when we talk about changing hearts and minds, we don't go from like 0 to 60 right there. Like, there's a lot of conversations that need to happen. So even if you have a Republican representative in Congress, I still urge you to reach out and talk to that member. Talk to the people who work in their office. Talk to the people who support them. Talk to them directly. And then, was there a third part of the question? I just want to make sure I got everything.
Oh, I think you got everything.
Right.
So before we close, I think this is a double part question for both of you. So I'm gonna kick it to Kate, you first, and then Reg. The question is, I'm a trans adult on Medicare. I definitely think my health care is next on the chopping block. Any recommendations on organizations that help with gender affirming care? I recommend Point of Pride.
I will let Reg speak to the organizations because I suspect he has a longer list, but I will say, this is a real concern. I wish that I could tell you that this is not something that you need to worry about. I know that that's an incredibly stressful and scary situation, and I just wish with my whole heart I could tell you it's fine, it's fine. You're worrying over nothing, but I don't think you are worrying over nothing. And we're going to keep fighting, and so are our other partners across the movement and across the progressive space, right? Because we know how important healthcare is and we are going to keep fighting for it, and it's incredibly important. So part of my answer would be to stay tuned, because from a political standpoint, we're going to be continuing to fight, and that will mean submitting comments. It will mean contacting your legislators. It will mean all those things. So we will be in touch with you when there are actions that we can offer so that folks can do that fighting back. And I'd please know that, yes, it is right to be very concerned about this right now, and that you are not alone, and that you have a whole host of folks who care really deeply about this, who are going to be fighting for you to be able to have preserved access to that care. Reg, I'll send it to you.
Yes. There are organizations. Point of Pride is an excellent org. There's also the Jim Collins Foundation. Trans Lifeline has micro grants. However, more so than just the organizations. I know that the Campaign for Southern Equality has a great program for trans youth specifically who are looking for care. And I know there are discussions about opening that up because of the point that you just highlighted. Make sure that you are tying in with your community, with your local community, to the extent that you can. If there's a state equality group, there's state equality groups in most of the states. Get involved there. Get involved with a trans-led org that is somewhere in your state. Even if it's not near you personally, reach out to them, because I assure you that on the community level, There are a number of organizations that are doing the real grassroots mobilization and mutual support that's needed in this time. And so, whether you are in a blue state or a red state, if you are a trans person who is afraid of losing care, the most important thing that you can do right now is find your community. We need to find each other because we will take care of each other and we will save each other and we will get through this together.
Thank you, Reg. I want to add one quick thing on to what Reg had to say, which is when we're thinking about healthcare, we know there's going to be a lot of cuts to healthcare coming up in the reconciliation fight. So if you're available, if you're interested, no matter where you live, we're going to be trying to get people involved in trying to stop this awful bill. So definitely visit our Mobilize. I know the link is in the chat. And all right, Kate, I'm going to ask you one last question, which is, shouldn't we focus on the Equality Act before the Transgender Act you are discussing? We need to think about getting too far ahead of the majority strategically. Don't we need to rethink these strategic approaches?
That is obviously a huge question, right? And I don't mean to be dismissive of the idea that we have to be really thoughtful about the strategy that we are taking in this moment. That is absolutely true. I mean, it just is absolutely true. We do have to be thoughtful. The Equality Act is, for folks who don't know, is HRC's sort of signature piece of legislation, and this would add LGBTQ people into our existing federal civil rights laws, as well as expanding our existing federal civil rights laws to include more protections for folks with multiple protected characteristics. For example, increasing the scope of public accommodations in federal law so that it looks like the scope of public accommodations in state law, and that would help everybody who is covered by public accommodations non-discrim. Hit me up for your questions about public accommodations. I love them. Public accommodations, any place that you can walk into and expect to be served as a member of the public, like a coffee shop or a library. The Equality Act is absolutely continues to be our #1 signature piece of legislation, and we are fighting for it absolutely positively every day. I don't want to, in mentioning another piece of legislation, I don't want to make it sound like the Equality Act is no longer a priority. It absolutely is. And the bill that Reg is speaking about is a really interesting bill. It does a lot of really important things, including training doctors on making sure that they can provide culturally competent care, making sure that doctors understand about the science, right? Like, that's something that the we've seen a lot in the Q&A today, right? Is people who just want to know more about the science. Well, you know who needs to know more about the science? The doctors who are providing this care. So that bill would do a lot of things and is a much smaller piece of legislation in terms of overall scope than the Equality Act, which is a sweeping once in a generation civil rights update, right? So what we have to be doing is both things. We have to be working on the smaller pieces of legislation that are going to demonstrably impact people's lives, and we need to be working on our big pieces of legislation that are going to absolutely change the legal landscape in ways that are incredibly important and frankly are a much bigger lift in terms of actually getting it through Congress, right? So we need to be doing the work. And as Reg said, it's always worth talking to your legislator, even if you don't think that they're going to agree with you. Or I'm sorry, John, maybe it was you who said that. Either, both of them are full of wisdom about how you should talk to Republicans. You should talk to Democrats who you think maybe are soft. You should talk to anybody. You should talk to your mother. You should talk to your mother-in-law. You should talk to your mother-in-law's best friend. You should talk to anybody who will listen to you about why trans equality is not a political issue. It is a moral issue, and why taking away people's health care because you don't get it is not how this country is supposed to work. Right? There are lots of things in this country I don't get. I'll spare you the full list, but I don't get to just take people's health care away because I don't understand. That's not how it works. That's not how this country works. We need to be able to get best practice healthcare. So totally appreciate the question. That strategy is absolutely something that we are thinking about because we know we need to be able to get things done. We also know that this work takes time. We have to be building in the places where building is what we need to be doing. We need to be acting boldly in places where acting boldly is what we need to be doing. We can do both, and we are doing both. And so I really appreciate that question because the fight is on multiple fronts, and we have to keep responding in all of those places. And so I really appreciate the question, and I really appreciate the energy in the chat with so many people who have exciting thoughts and questions. I wish we could talk to every single one of you, because these are great things that you've brought up.
Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you, Reg, for coming on and talking about all of that. As Kate said, we have to keep fighting, and we have put a lot of ways for you to do that in the chat. So if you haven't signed up to volunteer yet, now is your time. We will also be doing a lot of things like talking to lawmakers. We have these trainings coming up, so we hope to see you again. And with that, thanks so much, everybody.